This is the second lecture for Monday, March 30th, and we're talking about diversity within communities. And so we're going to look at the influences on communities in terms of what kind of things influence the diversity that you find in communities in the first place. Some communities are very diverse, others aren't. That's basically the thing. We looked at how you measure diversity. So let's say that you have some success going around to different communities and measuring community diversity. You've agreed on some index of diversity that you like, that you think reflects how diverse a community is, that reflects the level of complexity of interactions that are taking place. So, what kind of things result in a community being very diverse? What kind of things result in a community being not very diverse? Well, one of the things that people have come upon, deducted over time, is that when they've gone around and looked at these different areas and looked at communities that were diverse and communities that weren't diverse, well, one of the main features that correlates well with community diversity is how complex the habitat is, or how complex the environment is. And if you go back to this idea of niches and this idea of competitive exclusion, that no two species can occupy the same niche, it makes sense, because the more complex an environment is, the more complex a habitat is, the more niches there are likely to be. The more niches there are, then the more species there's going to be. Some of this also that we'll see is going to be related to productivity. All of the living things in a community need energy. They all need some source of energy. So the more productivity, the more photosynthesis to begin with, but other aspects as well, then the more likely that a community is going to be diverse. They all need a certain amount of energy. The more energy there is, then the odds are, it's not always true, but the odds are that there's going to be more species. So if we look at two of the most complex, diverse communities on land and in the water, in the ocean, one of those is tropical rainforests on land, very diverse, thousands and thousands of species, all kinds of different niches, very complex habitat, three-dimensional, hundreds of feet of canopy, and there's a huge amount of primary productivity. It's warm, a lot of rainfall, and a lot of water, a lot of nutrients. Photosynthesis, sunlight and water, two of the main needs for photosynthetic organisms. There's a lot of it there. And then if you look at coral reefs, very complex habitat, three-dimensional, again, shallow water, warm water, a lot of photosynthesis, a lot of energy. So if you look around the world, you see two of the most energy-rich environments, coral reefs in the water and tropical rainforests on land. It's not surprising that those are two of the most diverse communities. If you look around the world and you see the structural heterogeneity, or how many different habitats there are to occupy in this three-dimensional habitat, coral reefs in the ocean, very, very complex. Tropical rainforests, very complex. Very rich in species diversity. Well, if you look around the world, in fact, and you look at some of the trends that you find as far as community diversity, one of the things is that latitude has a big influence on species diversity. The farther away you get from the equator, the more diversity tends to decrease, diversity within communities. So you go all the way up to the poles and you start finding communities that aren't very diverse. close to the equator, whether it's on land or whether it's in the water, you find communities that are really, really diverse. Depth in the ocean is another thing. If you're talking about aquatic systems, the farther you go underwater, the less light there is, the colder it is, the higher the pressure is. It's an extreme environment, but especially with energy. The amount of sunlight that reaches the depths decreases the farther you go down, so it has a lot to do with energy. Not surprising, the farther you go down deep, then there's a tendency for community structure, community diversity to decline with depth. If you go up in elevation on land, you find the same thing. It's colder, there's not as much sunlight, it's a harder environment, not as much primary productivity. And then another thing, directly related to humans, is the amount of pollution. Pollution tends to decrease diversity. So areas where there's a lot of pollution, it becomes a more extreme environment, harder to survive, fewer niches that can be occupied by organisms that can tolerate pollution, and so communities tend to become less diverse. So if you think about sunlight in the ocean, sunlight on land, where is the most solar radiation on Earth? Where is the greatest amount of rainfall? It's by the equator. Where's the greatest diversity on land? It's by the equator. And rainfall doesn't have so much to do with aquatic systems, but where's the greatest amount of solar radiation that reaches the face of the Earth in terms of the ocean? It's by the equator. So sunlight certainly has a lot to do with how much energy there is, and also it translates directly into this trend of diversity around the world. So here's an example with two different types of animals, ants and birds. If you look at this figure for ants, this is in the whole world, from the North Pole to the South Pole. Where is the apex in this curve, the number of ant species you find on Earth? It's by the equator. Near the equator, there's a huge number of species of ants in the tropical rainforest, basically. You move north, the number of ant species declines. You move south from the equator, the number of ant species declines. If you look at birds, then this is just in the northern hemisphere. The number of birds that you find by the equator, on the right of that curve at 0 degrees north, that's the equator, there's 1,000 species of birds on average. That's a huge diversity. And as you move farther and farther north, or left on that curve, all the way up to 80 degrees north, the number of species of birds declined. If you had the same data for the southern hemisphere and could add that to this figure, then it would look similar to that curve that you find for the ants. So latitude. What does latitude have to do with community diversity? Well, as I mentioned before, latitude has a lot to do with energy. So if you look at the number of mammal species, if you look at the number of bird species, if you threw in ants like we did, this is just in North America. See, down by the equator, the closer you get to the equator, the closer you get to South America anyway. So this includes Central America. The greatest diversity of mammals is in Central America. As you go farther and farther north, you look at how few species of mammals there are up in Canada compared to Central America. If you look at the number of species of birds, you see the same thing. There's a decline in the number of species. A lot of it has to do with solar radiation, energy, as well as a level of complexity of the species that you find there, or of the habitat. Another factor, if you look at aquatic systems, is depth. You go farther down into the water, light attenuates, gets filtered out. There's not as much light for primary production. Less energy, less diversity, basically. So if you look at snails, you look at tube worms, then down to a certain depth, there's an increase in the number of snails. But below a certain depth, when there's no more energy, and there's not very much energy in the water above, and there's not much energy that's falling down from the surface to reach these depths, then the number of species declines. And so these depths might be a little extreme. In a lot of places, if you looked at the number of snails or echinoderms or tube worms, starfish, crab, crustaceans, then it might be a lot less than 2,000 meters, this peak. But at 2,000 meters, it's not that far from shore. There's still a lot of input from energy from the waters above. But if you get out deeper than that, then the amount of energy, especially, in some cases, the habitat complexity declines quite a bit, and you have a real drop-off in the number of species. Pollution, the third thing. If you look at pollution, it's hard to survive with pollution. So it's not so much affecting the habitat complexity, it's not affecting the amount of energy, but it's affecting the ability of organisms to survive. Sometimes pollution is nutrients, like nitrogen, so there's a big plankton bloom or an algae bloom or something like that. But there's a direct influence of pollution, whether it's killing things or making it a harsher environment for things to survive, or whether it's introducing some nutrient that's changing the dynamics of the species composition in a community. But the more pollution there is, the fewer types of species there tends to be, and the fewer number of individuals there tends to be in species, because it's harder to survive. So with diversity, looking around the world, then energy, habitat complexity, pollution. Those are three main factors that influence community diversity around the globe. All right, the next thing for us to look at then is you find these patterns globally around the world, then what other kind of things influence diversity within communities, especially not just spatially, that up north or by the equator, those kind of things, but what influences the diversity of communities over time. So we can stop here with this survey of diversity of communities around the world, and when we come back on Wednesday, we can change our focus to looking at how other things influence species richness, especially how communities change over time.